The sky was the wrong shade of blue. For 366 days, Captain Dr. Aris Thorne had known only the profound, all-consuming blackness of the void, a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical substance, punctuated by the relentless, unfiltered glare of a sun that was not her own. Now the Earth's atmosphere, a fragile smear of watercolor, seemed impossibly thin, its cerulean hue a pale imitation of the rich, deep indigo she'd grown accustomed to. It was the first lie of many, she suspected. Reentry was a violence the simulators could never fully capture. The shuttle shuddered around her, a tinkin in the fist of a furious god. G-forces pressed her into her seat, a crushing weight that made each breath a battle. She welcomed it. The physical struggle was a concrete thing, a problem with a known solution. Endure. It was the silence that was unnerving. The absence of the constant, low hum of the stargazer's life support systems, the lack of data streams whispering in her ear, the end of the solitary, profound quiet that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. Then the violence ceased. The parachutes deployed with a soft, final whump, and the world outside the viewport righted itself. The Pacific Ocean sprawled beneath her, a vast, indifferent expanse of churning gray. The recovery ship, a speck that grew into a distinct shape, was waiting. The procedure was flawless, a ballet of practiced efficiency. Hands, human hands, reached for her. Their touch was jarring. The medical checks were a blur of light in her eyes, needles in her arm, and questions fired at her in calm, professional tones. She answered by rote, her voice a rusty instrument she hadn't used in a year for anything beyond status reports and the occasional, recorded message to mission control. Her body felt leaden, alien. Her muscles, though diligently exercised in zero-G, protested the relentless pull of a planet that now felt too large, too demanding. Captain Thorne, a man in a crisp NASA flight suit, stood at the door of her temporary quarters aboard the ship. Welcome home. I'm Dr. Evans. We're prepping you for transport to Houston. Your reintegration protocol begins immediately upon landing. Reintegration. The word sounded so sterile, so simple. As if one could simply plug a person back into their old life like a module into a space station. Protocol, Aris repeated, the word tasting like dust on her tongue. Standard procedure for long-duration solo missions, Dr. Evans said with a reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. We've learned a lot since the early days. The psychological adjustment is as critical as the physical. You'll be assigned a dedicated coach. They'll help you navigate everything. The sensory overload, the social re-engagement, the media requests. Aris nodded, her gaze drifting past him to the porthole, where a sliver of the Earth's curve was still visible. Everything. He meant the fact that the rustle of her own jumpsuit was too loud, that the smell of recycled ship air and disinfectant was an assault, that the thought of seeing her family, her friends, her empty apartment, filled her with a dread as cold as the space she'd just left. Who's the coach? She asked, more out of a sense of duty to the conversation than genuine curiosity. We've contracted one of the best. A specialist in post-isolation trauma and high-achiever psychology. Dr. Leo Valdez. His file is in your briefing packet. You'll meet him tomorrow at 0900. The name hit her with the force of a micrometeoroid strike. Leo. Not a common name. Not for her. It couldn't be. The universe was vast, but it had a cruel, precise sense of irony. Her mind, usually a fortress of disciplined focus, fractured. She was thrown back in time, 13 months ago. A bar near Cape Canaveral, the air thick with the smell of salt and spilled beer. The frantic, desperate energy of the night before a launch. The need to feel something, anything, other than the terrifying weight of the year to come. He had been there, a spot of warm, grounded calm in the storm of her pre-mission anxiety. Dark hair that fell into his eyes, a laugh that was surprisingly gentle for a man with such a solid frame. They'd talked for hours, a conversation that felt less like a first meeting and more like a continuation of something long interrupted. He hadn't treated her like an astronaut, a monument to human achievement. He'd treated her like a woman on the edge of a precipice. And she, for one night, had let herself fall, not into the void, but into him. It had been a single, perfect, stolen night. A parenthesis in time. In the harsh light of the launch day morning, with the ghost of his touch still on her skin, it had felt like a mistake. A complication. A gravitational pull she couldn't afford. She'd left a note. Thank you for everything. I have to go. And had compartmentalized the memory into a locked box labeled Earthly Indulgences. And now, he was to be her reintegration coach. Dr. Leo Valdez. The lie of the blue sky was nothing compared to this. The debriefing room at Johnson Space Center was aggressively normal. Beige walls, a faux wood table, a carafe of water that seemed too heavy when she tried to pour it. Her hand trembled slightly. Earth gravity was a tyrant. She had spent the night in her old quarters, staring at the ceiling that felt oppressively close. She'd run through the scenarios. She could request a new coach. But on what grounds? I had a one-night stand with him, and it was too intense? That would sound unprofessional, unstable. The very thing the reintegration protocol was designed to prevent. So she would endure. She was good at that. The door opened precisely at 0900. And there he was. Time had been kind to Leo Valdez. The same dark, expressive eyes, the same easy confidence in the way he moved. But the man who walked in was not the charming stranger from the bar. He was sharper, more contained. He wore a dark blazer over a simple shirt, no tie. In his hands was a tablet and a simple file folder. His gaze, when it met hers, was professional, assessing, and completely, utterly unreadable. "Captain Thorne," he said, his voice a calm, steady baritone that nonetheless sent a shockwave through her system. "It's good to see you safely returned. I'm Dr. Leo Valdez. I'll be your reintegration coach." He extended his hand. Aris took it, her own feeling small and cold in his warm, firm grip. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated memory. The feel of his hands on her back, in her hair. "Dr. Valdez," she managed, her voice thankfully steady. "Thank you." He sat opposite her, placing the tablet on the table. "The purpose of our sessions is to facilitate a smooth transition back to terrestrial life. We'll be working closely for the next 12 weeks. My role is to be a sounding board, a guide, and a safe space. Everything discussed here is confidential, within the limits of the law and your safety." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "I want to acknowledge the unique circumstances of our reacquaintance. We can address it directly, or we can let it be. My primary concern is your well-being. The choice is yours." It was a perfect clinical speech, and it infuriated her. He had reduced their night, that raw, beautiful collision of two souls, to unique circumstances. "Let's let it be," Aris said, her tone cooler than she intended. "I'd prefer to focus on the protocol." A faint, almost imperceptible flicker in his eyes. A crack in the professional facade? Or was it her imagination? "Of course," he nodded. "Then let's begin. Tell me, Aris, may I call you Aris? What is the most overwhelming sensation right now?" She almost laughed. "You. Your presence in this room." But she didn't. She looked down at her hands, clenched in her lap. "Gravity," she said, opting for the physical truth. "It's relentless. Everything is so heavy. My body, my thoughts. It's exhausting." Leo nodded, making a note on his tablet. "Not a judgment, just an observation. Your proprioception, your body's sense of itself in space, has been recalibrated for a weightless environment. It will take time to readjust. The fatigue is normal. Your brain is processing a staggering amount of sensory data. It's been spared for a year. The color green, for instance. Has it affected you?" She looked up, startled. How could he know? On the car ride from the airfield, she had seen a tree, a live oak, its leaves a vibrant, almost violent green. She had literally gasped, her hand flying to the window. It had felt like a physical blow. "Yes," she whispered. "The human visual cortex isn't designed for the monochrome of a spacecraft or the stark contrasts of space. Earth is an assault of color and texture. We'll work on grounding techniques." He leaned forward slightly, and for a moment, the doctor was gone, and the man from the bar was there. "It's okay to not be okay, Aris. You've done something less than 100 people in all of human history have ever done. The coming home is often harder than the leaving." In that moment, she felt seen in a way she hadn't since her return. Not as a hero, not as a specimen, but as a human being struggling to find her footing. And it was terrifying. This was the real danger of Leo Valdez. Not the awkwardness of their past, but his terrifying, penetrating empathy. The weeks that followed were a strange, disjointed dance. Aris moved through her life like a ghost haunting her own past. Her apartment, kept for her by a friend, felt like a museum exhibit titled A Life Interrupted. The milk in the fridge was over a year old. The plants were long dead. The silence was different from the silence of space. It was a heavy, waiting silence, full of dust and forgotten things. Her sessions with Leo were the only anchors in the swirling chaos. They were a paradox, both the source of her greatest anxiety and her only respite. They never spoke of the night before her launch. Instead, they talked about everything else. The crushing noise of a supermarket. The disorienting experience of choosing from 50 different brands of cereal. The profound loneliness she felt in a crowded room. The way her family tiptoed around her, their conversations brittle and careful. Leo was brilliant at his job. He gave her exercises. 5 minutes of mindful observation in a garden, focusing on one sense at a time. He taught her breathing techniques to quell the panic that sometimes rose in her throat when the world became too much. He was patient, insightful, and relentlessly professional. And it was driving her mad. Because beneath the clinical dialogue, the current of their past hummed, a constant low-frequency vibration. She would catch him looking at her sometimes, a fleeting, unguarded expression in his eyes that was anything but professional. She found herself noticing the small things, the way he tapped his pen twice before asking a difficult question, the tiny scar just above his brow, the scent of his soap, the same scent from that night. She was reintegrating with the world, but she was becoming more and more entangled with him. The conflict came to a head during their 6th session. She was describing a nightmare, a common one where she was floating away from the stargazer, but instead of the blackness of space, she was falling into the deep, endless green of an earthly forest. "And what do you feel in the dream?" Leo asked, his voice soft. "I feel gravity," she said, the realization dawning as she spoke. "But it's not pulling me down. It's pulling me apart, like I'm being stretched between two worlds. I don't belong to either." Leo was silent for a long moment. The psychological term is existential displacement. But I think it's simpler than that. You're homesick. Aris stared at him. Homesick. For a metal can hurtling through the void. For the purpose. The clarity. The singular focus. For the self you were up there. Earth is messy. Life is messy. It has no mission parameters. Tears, hot and sudden, pricked at her eyes. She hated them. She never cried. It's all so meaningless down here. The traffic, the bills, the small talk. I faced the infinite, and now I'm supposed to care about what's for dinner. The infinite is easier, Leo said, his gaze intense. It doesn't ask you to live. It only asks you to survive. Living is harder. It's messy and complicated, and it happens in the details. He paused, and then he did the one thing he'd never done. He broke protocol. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It happens in connections, Aris. The touch was like a lightning strike. All the unspoken words, the suppressed memories, surged between them. The air crackled. She snatched her hand back as if burned. Don't. He leaned back, the shutters coming down over his eyes. I apologize. That was unprofessional. Yes, it was, she said, standing up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. I think we're done for today. She fled the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't running from him. She was running from the part of herself that had leaned into that touch, that wanted to fall into that connection, that was so desperately tired of being strong and alone. The turning point came from an unexpected direction, a media event. A televised interview, her first major public appearance since her return. She was supposed to be the shining hero, the embodiment of the American dream, a smiling, perfectly adjusted testament to human resilience. She sat under the hot lights, the host's smile a blinding white rictus. The questions were inane, pre-approved pablum. What was the view like? Weren't you scared? What's next for Captain Aris Thorne? She answered by rote, her public persona, calm, confident, witty, a suit of armor she'd worn 1,000 times. But she could feel the cracks forming. The lights were too bright, the makeup was caking on her skin, the host's perfume was suffocating. Then came the question she hadn't anticipated. Captain, your mission was not just about scientific discovery, was it? It was also a test of human endurance. A year in complete isolation. Many would say that's a recipe for madness. Can you tell us about the lowest point? The moment you truly felt you might not make it. The question hung in the air, a trapdoor swinging open beneath her feet. The carefully constructed armor shattered. The memory wasn't of fear or of technical failure. It was of a moment 6 months in. She was floating by the viewport, watching the earth, a distant, beautiful marble. And she had felt nothing. Not love, not longing, not wonder. Nothing. A complete and utter emotional vacuum. She had felt herself unraveling, her identity dissolving into the infinite black. She had pressed her forehead against the cold glass and whispered, "Is anyone there?" She hadn't been asking mission control. Sitting in the interview chair, the expectant faces of the audience staring at her, she was back in that moment. The emptiness rushed back, a tidal wave of existential terror. Her breath hitched. The studio lights swam. She was going to break down, live on national television. And then her eyes found him, standing in the shadows at the back of the studio, leaning against the wall. Leo. He wasn't supposed to be here. But he was. His arms were crossed, his posture relaxed, but his gaze was locked on hers. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply looked at her, his expression steady, grounded, and utterly present. I see you, his eyes said. And I'm here. She took a shaky breath, the world snapping back into focus. She looked at the host. The lowest point, she said, her voice clear and strong, is also the point where you find out who you are. It's not about madness. It's about stillness. And in that stillness, you find a strength you didn't know you possessed. The audience erupted in applause. The host beamed. It was the perfect soundbite. But Aris only had eyes for the man in the shadows. And she knew, with a certainty that felt more solid than the ground beneath her feet, that she was lying. The strength she had found in that moment wasn't inside her. It was the anchor she saw in his eyes. After the interview, she found him waiting for her by the stage door. You weren't supposed to be here, she said. I know, he replied. I saw the question list. I knew that one would be trouble. You saved me. No, he said, shaking his head. You saved yourself. I just reminded you that you could. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the departing audience echoing around them. Why did you take this job, Leo? She asked, the question she had been too afraid to voice. You had to know it was me. He looked away, down the empty corridor, then back at her, his professional mask finally, completely gone. The raw vulnerability in his eyes stole her breath. Because when you left, he said, his voice rough with emotion, you took a piece of me with you. And for a year, I watched you on TV, floating in that tin can, and I felt like I was the one who was untethered. When NASA called, I knew it was unethical. I knew it was a conflict of interest. I knew it was probably the stupidest professional decision of my life. But I took the job because it was the only way I could think of to get that piece of me back. Or maybe to give it to you for good. The confession hung between them, rewriting the rules of their entire world. They didn't go back to the sterile debriefing room. They went to his apartment. It was nothing like she'd imagined. It was warm, lived in. Books were stacked on every surface, a guitar leaned in a corner, and a large, comfortable-looking sofa was draped with a soft blanket. It was a home, not a way station. He made her tea, and they sat on that sofa, a careful foot of space between them, and they talked. They talked about everything they had avoided. He told her about the morning he woke up and found her gone, the note on the pillow. The sting of it, the foolish hope he'd harbored for months that she'd call. The way he'd thrown himself into his work, specializing in isolation psychology partly because of her, a way to understand the pull that had been stronger than the one they'd felt that night. She told him about the silence. The true, profound silence of space that wasn't a silence at all, but a symphony of cosmic noise that you could only hear when you were completely alone. She told him about the fear, the loneliness, the moments of sublime beauty. She told him about the emotional vacuum, the feeling of dissolving. She told him things she hadn't told the mission psychologists, things she had barely admitted to herself. She was crying, and she didn't try to stop. He didn't either. He simply listened, his presence a solid, warm reality in the storm of her reentry. I'm a mess, Leo, she whispered, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I'm not the woman you met in that bar. I'm broken. You're not broken, he said, his voice firm. You're expanded. You've been to a place that changes a person at a cellular level. You can't just snap back. You have to grow into the person you've become. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. He cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The touch was no longer a jolt of memory, but a homecoming. I don't want to be your patient, she said. You haven't been for a long time, he replied. This time, when they kissed, it was nothing like their first frantic coming together. It was slow, deliberate, a conversation without words. It was a promise. It was gravity, not as a tyrant, but as a gentle, inevitable force, pulling them back to a center they had both been orbiting for over a year. Later, curled against his chest in the dark, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart, Aris felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The two worlds inside her, the infinite black and the vibrant, messy green, were no longer at war. They were just parts of her. And for the first time since she'd looked out the viewport at the wrong shade of blue, she felt truly, completely home. 3 months later. The press called it her second mission. A lecture tour, sharing her experiences with the world. She stood at the podium in a packed auditorium, but she felt no panic, no disconnect. She felt grounded. She spoke of the science, the wonder, the fear. And then, at the end, she deviated from her script. "They tell you that space is the final frontier," she said, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "But they're wrong. The final frontier isn't out there." She pointed upwards, then brought her hand down, tapping her chest. "It's in here. The journey of leaving is nothing compared to the journey of returning. Of learning to live with the silence you've brought back with you. Of finding your gravity." Her eyes found his in the third row. "Leo." He gave her a small, private smile. "We are all, in our own ways, astronauts," she concluded. "Trying to find our way back to each other. Trying to land. And the most important thing I learned, up there in all that nothing, is that we can't do it alone. Our greatest mission isn't to explore the universe. It's to connect with it. And that connection starts right here, on this beautiful, fragile blue planet. It starts with the gravity between us." She stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause. But she only heard one pair of hands clapping. She walked off the stage, not into the isolation of fame, but into the warm, waiting embrace of a man who had taught her that the most terrifying and the most beautiful force in the universe wasn't the void. It was the pull of a human heart. She was home.